This week, I'm throwing a particularly challenging shape. It's a bowl with a very narrow foot, sloping, overhanging walls with a straight, stepped section at the top. These bowls, if you can call them that, have been a recent fascination of mine, and lately I've been trying to throw them thinner just so there's slightly less trimming to do, yet there's only so far I can take this shape at the throwing stage, and so many of the small defining details will have to be done when it's leather hard. And that will be the topic of next week's video, together with testing out some new trimming tools. So, for throwing this bowl I'm going to be using particularly firm clay. This means it'll be harder to centre, but it also means it will have much more strength as I'm throwing it, and that will be very useful for the overhanging walls and the stepped portion of the rim. If I were to use very soft clay, I think this shape would be exceedingly difficult to throw. You can check to see how well your clay is wedged by simply cutting it in half to check for any air pockets inside. This cross section looks pretty good, although I am still using a slightly more grogged variant of my usual stoneware clay body, which will, to some degree, help with this process, as clay bodies that are a bit gritty tend to have a bit more strength, and in the long run, as the piece is dried, glazed and fired, it'll be less likely to warp or crack. Warm water's next. I never really throw pots with it cold, unless it's the height of summer, as if my hands are cold and frozen. They can feel stiff, and, well, that's completely impractical for the process of throwing pots on the wheel. And then I set up my light and position a mirror in front of me, through which I'll be able to see a perfect side view of the pot I'm making, which means I don't have to lean back awkwardly or get off the wheel in order to see the shape of the pot I'm throwing. I then firmly slam the piece of clay down in the middle of the wheel. And the first thing I do is use a wetted hand, which I press into the bottom of the lump of clay to seal it onto the wheel head. With the clay being on the hard side, I'll have to use a bit more force than normal, so the lump of clay being stuck down securely is vital. The stoneware is then coned up and down numerous times. This improves its workability, but that's all I'll say in this video about it, as it's a topic I've made a much longer, more in-depth video about already. So if you are interested in learning about more of the technicalities behind this process, I'll leave a link to that video on screen now and in the description below. Essentially though, you can sort of look at this process a bit like wedging on the wheel. It helps to mix the clay body even further, making it more homogeneous and even, and therefore more plastic and easier to throw with. And this is something that has even more of an impact when using firm clay, as when throwing with very soft stoneware, any slight, very subtle irregularity in the body can sort of be ignored or easily dealt with. Next, I open the lump of clay up, creating a sort of V shape in the middle, as because this will be a bowl, I obviously want it to have a curved interior, and the last thing you want to do is throw a flat base in a pot like this. So it should look something like this, with thick walls and a very narrow base. I've also purposefully left a really thick bottom, as I want this pot to have a tall, elegant foot. And even if I don't use all the clay there, it's better having too much material as opposed to not enough. Now, my aim isn't to get much height with this first pull, rather I'm just trying to thin out the walls somewhat from their initial thickness, as this will make the subsequent pulls, which I do with a sponge, much easier. I also quickly just centre the walls again to compress the rim and to make the shape as stable and even as possible before I begin lifting the walls up more aggressively. And to do that, I'll be using a Mud Tools throwing sponge. It's soaked in water prior to the lift. This way the point of contact that's lifting up cannot dry out, which leads to more even, consistent pulls, and when I'm using one of these, the point of contact on the outside is larger and it has a smoother surface, and for me at least it makes pulling up larger amounts of clay more doable and consistent. I don't use it when I'm doing the finer work, yet for the first few pulls it works fantastically. My aim at this point is to create a rough bowl shape, with walls that are even throughout, although as I'm going to be stretching this form out much wider, it's imperative that I don't make them too thin at the top, as I don't want the walls to split, as I'll be throwing the rim to be about twice as wide as it is now. The lowest 3 centimeters of this shape is essentially a thick disc of clay, which means I can press into it to lift up more material without having to worry about distorting the interior shape too much. Once I think it's tall enough, I do one last pull just to widen out the shape a touch more, as from this point I'll be using a kidney on the outside to push the clay against to create the overhanging, more angular walls. And at the top of each pull, I spend a moment just compressing the rim to make sure it's even and spinning without any undulations. Now, the reason I'll be doing the rest of the shaping against a metal kidney is because this creates a drier, stronger surface that will be able to hold its shape better as the severe overhang is created. Although this will, at times, make the pot look as if it's spinning a bit uncontrollably, but rest assured, everything will come together eventually. And at times I'm going to have to use a heat gun, a paint stripper, to dry out certain regions of this pot so that I can continue to shape it without the overhanging walls continuing to drop lower and lower. Like always, I position the metal rib roughly where I want the profile of the pot to be, and then my left hand from the inside is pushing out against it. The hardest part here is probably keeping that right hand very steady and still, as if that metal edge is moving up and down, the walls of the pot will follow suit and the whole form can very quickly begin to unravel. But we're almost there. You'll notice that I haven't really touched the top section. This is because there's no point scraping the slip off this part, as I'm going to keep throwing that section. For this part, I switch back to using my fingertips, as I need to be able to feel the cross-section to gauge how thin the walls are here, and so that I can really understand the shape, both of which would be harder to ascertain if there was a piece of thick sponge between my finger and the clay. It's always best doing these delicate jobs without a sponge, in my opinion. I then use a sharper, smaller metal kidney to continue shaping the top, and again I'm pushing the clay out from the inside against the tool. This way the chance that it catches and potentially destroys the pot is far, far less. This top section itself is really very thin now, so I won't work on it too much at this point. Instead I'll wait until the piece is turned leather hard. There'll be a lot of this towards the end. Quick blasts with the heat gun to dry out the surface so that it's easier to shape without the thin walls moving more than they should. Now for the part I've been dying to clean up, the foot. And I'm probably being more careful here than you think, as if too much clay gathers on the tool, that mass of material can push up against the walls above it, indenting them, causing an undulation which will be felt over the entire piece. So I find it's just safer to remove the clay bit by bit rather than trying to gouge it all away in one fell swoop. Now we're almost there, yet whilst the exterior has been shaped, the interior of this pot is still pretty rough and needs to be refined. I begin by mopping out all the water left inside from the throwing process. And as this task will involve pushing against the interior surface, I'm going to dry out the exterior form quite a lot, as I don't want my pushing on the inside to affect the shape on the outside, so it needs to be firm enough to withstand this. And all I'm going to be doing here is rounding off this interior shape, which I do with a few kidneys that have different curves to match certain parts of the pot. I'm also not worried about making it completely perfect at this stage, as I will be able to trim the interior shape after the pot has turned leather hard in a few days' time. The last part to refine, and perhaps the hardest, is this small step just beneath the rim. Again, I can focus on this more easily at the leather hard stage, but for now I just want to get rid of the worst of the throwing rings. There is a slight undulation in the rim. It wavers slightly, but it's nothing too concerning, and I'm sure once the wheel stops spinning, you won't even notice it. With one final bit of drying, I can wire the pot off the wheel and transfer it onto the bat in front of me. Which, as the pot has been dried out so much, is quite easy to do. It almost looks like it's been trimmed already, but there's still quite a lot of work left in this pot, especially hollowing out the foot, refining the stepped section at the top, and making sure the interior curve is to my liking, as I like my bowls to have a curved interior whilst retaining an angular exterior. It's a deceptively difficult shape to throw, and good luck to you if you attempt it. For now though, if you're watching this on May 19th, my online shop is about to be restocked. It goes live at 7 PM BST, so for the next couple of weeks I'll be doing a lot of posting and packaging, which all leads to freeing up more space in the studio, which means I can begin throwing more pots. If you do purchase something from my update, thank you. And thank you too for taking your time to watch this video. And I'll see you next week for the trimming of this angular bowl.